In the first week, I gave a brief definition from Aristotle as what counts as a single science and where you draw the boundaries between different sciences. I talked about those sciences which are unified according to one form, i.e., things like geometry, the study of shapes, or botany, the study of plants. I also talked about those sciences which are conceived of as being unified in relation to one nature or one principle, and medicine is a very good example of this. That's to say that medicine was conceived of broadly by the Greeks as a single study, as the study of how to bring about human health. However, beyond a basic consensus, there were constant and interesting definitional wrangles about what falls under the scope of medicine, what makes a disease a single disease, and so on. I hope to show you some of these discussions today, as well as focusing on some of the overlaps between medicine, religion, and other spheres of everyday life. The social context we're working in through all periods of Greek antiquity is one in which life expectancy, although not terribly low, was not as high as we take for granted these days. Infant mortality was high, death rates in childbirth were high, and many conditions that we can treat easily were fatal. Without antibiotics and antiseptics, infections were very likely to kill you. This isn't the same as there being no people who live to old age. Sometimes in historical films and so on, we have this picture of people particularly in the medieval world, more than the ancient world, of people in their 40s being thought of as old. That's not the case. There's obviously, as you'll know, plenty of evidence of people living to advanced ages. It's more that if you did get a disease, it was much more likely to kill you. So this was a world in which the doctor's work was a continual uphill battle against disease. We know, for example, from the patient case histories in some of the treatises that we had, that even under the attention of a doctor, maybe more than half of patients for any serious disease were expected to die. It's likely that patients knew this. While we tend to think of going to the doctor as a way, usually, of fixing a problem, or at least getting referred to a specialist who could do so, as far as we know, for Greek patients, the doctor was more of a kind of last-ditch bottom line. Maybe this guy can do something worth a try. Croton, Cyrene, Cnidus and Cos were all famous for medical schools. The largest of these were Cos and Cnidus. We don't really have a sense of how many doctors would have trained there at any one time. But as far as we're aware, many doctors throughout classical antiquity were actually essentially itinerant, moving from town to town and offering their services. We know that doctors practice for payment, although our evidence on this is fairly mixed. The Hippocratic texts indicate that patients may have paid on sliding scales according to their means, and we certainly have references from antiquity of doctors treating patients for free, especially those who couldn't afford to pay. While in Plato's Republic, there is a reference to the idea that slaves were treated only by doctors who were themselves slaves and free people treated by free doctors. Case notes in the Hippocratic corpus and elsewhere tend to indicate that most doctors actually practiced across a wide social range, treating patients from a variety of different backgrounds. However, it's undoubtedly true that after the Roman conquest of Greece, many of the doctors practicing across the Roman Empire were slaves of Greek origin. An interesting feature of our evidence on the social and public position of doctors comes from the account of the doctor Democedes of Croton, who was active in about the 530s and 20s BC, and was referred to by Herodotus as the most skillful physician of his time. While in later life Democedes was court doctor under the Persian king Darius I, his first position was as public doctor employed by the city of Athens. Weirdly, we have details of his salary, which increased in the 3 consecutive years in which he was the city doctor. The first year, we know that he was paid a talent, the second year he was paid 100 minae, and in the third year he was paid 2 talents. So for context, given that the average skilled worker's daily wage in Athens was a drachma, a mina's 70 drachmae, a talent's 60 minae, that means that the average skilled worker earned about 5 minae per year. So Democedes is paid about 12 times the average skilled worker's yearly salary. So that's quite a lot. I mean, compare that to today, say the average bricklayer today earns about 25k. that puts Democritus on something like 300k. So that's like a kind of top flight surgeon salary in the US. It's big money. But remember, that's for the city doctor, the named sort of city doctor. We don't know exactly what that means in terms of his role, but we can safely assume that a lot of doctors would be earning a lot less than that. Nevertheless, they're skilled workers and they certainly could earn quite a lot. As a side note, interestingly, Democritus' curing of the Persian king Darius I's wife, Atossa, is our first recorded curing of what might actually be breast cancer. We have this case history. Many people think it was actually a cyst rather than breast cancer. We're unclear on how he did it. It's presumed he didn't do surgery, although if it's a cyst, maybe it's not ridiculous to imagine that he might have lanced and drained it. But certainly it's evidence that doctors were treating quite complex conditions. In fact, this kind of uncertainty, whether Atossa had breast cancer or a cyst, is actually very characteristic of what happens when we try to approach Greek medical sources. So despite the fact that we know quite a lot about some specific doctors like Democritus, our overall evidence is fairly patchy. So, for example, we know the name of Hippocrates and his son-in-law Polybus, but no other authors from the Hippocratic corpus, and I'll return to that in more detail. We know the names of lots of Hellenistic doctors, Diocles of Carystus, Praxagoras of Cos, Chrysippus of Cnidus, Herophilus of Chalcedon, Erystratus of Chaos. I promise that it's not a rule that you can only be a doctor in a place name starting with C, although that does seem to be, all of the medical schools do seem to be in places with names starting with C, or I guess Kappa. But we do know almost nothing about any of the writings of any of these people, and we only know them because of citations in later writers like Celsus, Rufus, Soranus and Galen. So beyond that, while we sometimes have very precise case histories or an ability to see exactly what diseases and conditions are being treated, sometimes it's extremely unclear, much more so than you might think, which is particularly interesting for the study of the history of medicine, because as you might be able to imagine, quite a lot of the people who want to study ancient medicine or look into ancient medicine or write things on ancient medicine are themselves practicing doctors or former practicing doctors, and it's something that people from a medical background sometimes find quite frustrating about Greek medicine, that some things they find very easily identifiable, some things they find really quite different. So with that warning in mind, I'm going to begin with the Hippocratic corpus, and then I'll move on to talking about Galen and some discussion of experiments. One of the most famous parts of the Hippocratic corpus in the public consciousness, even these days, is the Hippocratic Oath. The oath, which doctors in training still take a form of, at least here in the UK, is our oldest Western document of medical ethics. In essence, the original oath asked doctors to swear the principle of co-fraternity with other doctors and of patient confidentiality, and the principle of non-maleficence, including the specific renunciation of euthanasia, abortion and sexual involvement with patients. Some of those parts are not in the... the current oath is very modified. While in modern versions of the oath, the most commonly used one in the US was altered by a man with the wonderful name of Louis Lasagna, the specific references to maleficence are cut out, but the general spirit of the oath remains the same. The Hippocratic corpus itself, as a single collection, can't be traced back before about the 3rd century BC. The most likely explanation is that it was a group of different texts put together under the name of Hippocrates in the Hellenistic period, probably by Alexandrian scholars. We're not sure whether this was as a teaching text, a kind of massive textbook of kinds, although that does seem possible, or whether it was used more as a kind of library of Hippocrates' texts. In any case, the corpus has remained in that form since, with a few additions into the first couple of centuries AD. There's a lot of debate over these. There's about 60 treatises in there, and they're on a variety of different subjects. They can be split roughly into the following categories. So there's treatises on the nature of disease, that is, they're called nosological treatises. I'll come back to those. There's treatises on physiology and anatomy, and I talked a bit about some anatomy last week in the lecture on biology. There's treatises on embryology, which I also touched on, various things on medical ethics, on the philosophy of medicine, and on all sorts of specific branches of medicine like nutritional science, bioclimatology, and so on. It's a huge mass of stuff, and parts of it are in direct contradiction of other parts. It's written by, as far as we know, quite a wide range of doctors. Let's start with a few of the nosological theories. So, two of the major theoretical conflicts in this period in antiquity were around the essential nature and origin of disease and the question of the relationship between health, the body, and disease. On the first question, the essential nature of disease, positions range from the idea that all diseases stem from one disease, that is, that all diseases are really kind of different manifestations of one underlying disease. It's a kind of henonocism. I don't know if that's a real word, but you may know the religious equivalent of henotheism, which says that there's one underlying god and the other gods are kind of avatars. So there's a similar thing in medicine, which says maybe there's one kind of underlying disease and all diseases are different manifestations of this. Then on the other end of the spectrum, there were doctors who argued that there are as many different diseases as there are different patients, and that even what appears to be the same disease manifests so differently in different people that it's not very sensible to call it a single disease. And we still have some of that thinking in the way that syndromes and conditions, especially those that are quite rare, are named these days. For example, one thing that's been in the news a lot lately is learning difficulties and whether people with learning difficulties should get the vaccine. Of course, learning difficulties is not a single condition. It's a blanket term used for a huge variety of different things. In linguistic terms, Greek names for medical conditions, many of which, as you know, are still in use today, split into basically two categories. The first category is names of diseases taken from parts of the body. So a good example of that is nephritis. Nephros is the word for kidney, and anything ending in itis is to do with inflammation. Hepatitis from hepar, the liver. Pleuritis from pleuris, the side. Arthritis, arthron, the joint. Or another family of words, ophthalmia, is just a generic word for eye disease from ophthalmos, the eye. Then there's names of conditions that don't come from the part but come from the main symptoms. So phthisis is consumption or wasting, from thinane, to waste away or perish. Hydrops, what became known as dropsy later on, which is from hudor, water. Tetanus, from teno, stretch. Or stranguria from stranx and uron, which is trickling of urine. So this trend of naming diseases after the primary part of the body affected or the primary symptom, as you know, continues in modern days, although often there's a sort of combination or even sets of combinations within combinations of how diseases get named. A complicating factor is that sometimes one term is used for what we'd now see as a collection of different diseases. So sometimes there's descriptions of diseases in Greek texts that we would recognise as two different diseases, but which the Greeks take to be one disease and give a single word to. That means that sometimes in medical texts, when they refer to that disease, we're not sure which of our modern classifications they would have meant. But on the whole, they do recognise a whole lot of different diseases that we still broadly regard as being diseases. A theory that seems to run through a lot of the Hippocratic corpus is the theory of critical days. Let me explain what this means by reading you an example from a Hippocratic text, Epidemics 3, just so you get a sense of what's going on. So here's an example. I quote, "At Thasos, Pythian, who lay beyond the temple of Heracles, had a violent rigour and high fever as the result of strain, exhaustion, and insufficient attention to his diet. Tongue parched, he was thirsty and bilious and did not sleep. Urine rather dark, containing suspended matter that did not settle. Second day. About midday, chilling of the extremities, particularly around the hands and head, showed both aphasia and aphonia, so he couldn't speak or hear, and he was also dyspnoic, breathing badly for a long time. Then he became warm again and thirsty. A quiet night, slight sweating around the head. Third day, quiet. Late in the day, about sunset, slight chilling, nausea, disturbed bowels, followed by an uneasy, sleepless night. past a small constipated stool. 4th day, morning quiet. About midday, all symptoms were more pronounced. Chilled, aphasia and aphonia became worse. After a while, he became warm again and passed dark urine containing suspended matter. A quiet night, slept. This goes on until he dies on the 10th day. So as you can see, there's detailed observations being made on a day-by-day basis. Much of Epidemics 1 and 3, the Hippocratic texts, are of this type. The reason for the observations on the specific days is that doctors of this period, by and large, subscribed to the idea that diseases had what tend to be called by scholars critical days. So the 3rd day of symptoms, for example, on which you could base your prognosis. So these are days thought to be the ones on which you pay particular attention. So critical days would tell you if the patient would survive, and there's a different set of critical days to administer treatment. So different fevers, they gave different fevers different names depending on their critical days. And this practice was continued into the Middle Ages and later, and sometimes in medieval medical texts you see references to fevers as with names like tertians or quartans or quintans, which means that either that the symptoms will be the symptoms on the 3rd day or 4th day or 5th day or whatever it is are going to be the ones that tell you whether the patient will live, or they're fevers where you must administer treatment on the 3rd day, 4th day, 5th day, whatever context will tell you. So while this theory seems to drop out of fashion, or at least we don't get case histories in later writings, people like Galen with the same thing, they do still mention critical days, and it's hugely helpful for us to be able to see this kind of detailed observation that doctors were doing. You'll note, though, from the example I read, that the doctor doesn't, in this case, explain what, if anything, he's done in treating the patient, which leads us on to an important theoretical point, which is about what the role of the doctor is and what the role of nature or the world more widely is. So I mentioned earlier theoretical discussions of the relationship of health, disease and the body. There's several texts in the Hippocratic corpus that take the view that disease is an imbalance and that it's the joint role of the doctor and nature to combat diseases. Very important in this approach is the notion of what's called regimen. That is, it's a term that refers to a combination of things, including the patient's diet, but sometimes it also means exercise and other external factors. Hippocratic texts make an enormous amount of reference to regimen, and as you'll see when I put the bibliography up at the end, there's actually a treatise just on regimen, but also separate treatises on regimen in acute diseases, regimen in health, and so on. That later text, regimen in health, is particularly interesting for notions of the healthy body. Perhaps we'd like to call this something like nutritional science or even exercise science. And it goes through different categories of food, poultry, meat, fish, vegetables, grains, and so on, and discusses their relative importance in diet. Though thought on regimen considered not just the amount of food that patients should be eating in general and in specific cases, but also the particular beneficial qualities of specific foods in easing symptoms for certain diseases and so on, and the overall balance of foods in both the healthy and the sick body. This insistence on understanding the healthy body and in seeing nature as part of the battle against disease mirrors much of popular thought about disease in our own times. We often use the metaphor of battle when we're talking about diseases. That's a metaphor that dates back to the Hippocratic corpus. It's by no means universal in it, but it is there. The clearest example in modern thought is if you think about how people talk about cancer. Our language about cancer uses terms of war more often than for any other disease. You know, you quite regularly hear people saying things like, we'll beat cancer or he lost the battle. Disability theory has done much in recent years to examine some of these metaphors a bit more closely, and particularly to nuance our popular ideas about what constitutes a healthy body. After all, whether we think about the body of a person with a congenital physical deformity as being healthy, for example, I mentioned this when I talked about Aristotelian dualizers last week, many disability activists would rightly, I think, advocate for that. That's a philosophical question that exercised the Greeks as well. As I say, I mentioned it in the case of Aristotle and animals who are kind of slightly neither one nor the other. I'll come back to that briefly with some later thinkers, but for now I want to talk a little bit about Hippocratic theories of how disease is caused. There's a huge amount of discussion of the causes of disease across the various treatises of the Hippocratic corpus. Many Hippocratic texts demarcate between external and internal causes of disease. Internal causes include, as just discussed, the patient's regimen, but also there are various more hypothetical theories about the presence of the hot, the wet, the dry, and so on, and how an excess of one of these primary qualities can cause disease in a patient. Examples of external causes include air, winds, and seasons. And in fact, the treatise Airs, Waters, Places is particularly interesting as an example of this, as it discusses the effect of regional and local geography on the kinds of diseases that patients develop, and how those conditions affect the course and prognosis. Hippocratic writers very often try for overall definitions of diseases. So this is from chapter 1 of Affections. I quote, "In all men, diseases are caused by bile and phlegm. Bile and phlegm give rise to diseases when they become too dry or too wet or too hot or too cold in the body. These changes are brought about from food and drink, exercise, wounds, sex, the weather, and by the hot and the cold themselves." However, the writer of Regimen in Acute Diseases also realises that the same effect can be brought about by different causes, which makes it hard to diagnose exactly. The threads of discussion that run through all of the Hippocratic corpus on disease, the cause of disease, and the underlying nature of disease, later gets picked up in the Hellenistic period and becomes a bit more divergent. So by the Hellenistic period, broadly speaking, some opposed positions develop, and these opposed positions are those who are known as the empiricists, who include among their number Sextus Empiricus, and the dogmatists, who include Praxagoras, a rough contemporary of Plato. The empiricists believed, kind of in general terms, that medicine shouldn't get bogged down in abstract speculation about theoretical matters, and that medical discoveries must rest on observation of patients, accumulated evidence of cases, and so on. They believed that while it was important to understand the evident causes of diseases, searching for hidden causes of disease, particularly for theoretical explanations, was a bit of a waste of time and could lead to bad medical practice. They wouldn't use the word chemistry, although we might think of it in those terms, but they would, for example, find arguments about imbalances of humours or physiological arguments often to be unhelpful. They had as a central belief that nature was kind of beyond comprehension. The dogmatists, on the other hand, believed that for doctors to truly understand and to truly cure diseases, they must understand the underlying hidden causes, not just what was happening on the surface. Part of their interest, therefore, was in physiology and in trying to explain the kind of physics of the body. A central strand of their thinking was that doctors could not understand the diseased body if they didn't understand the healthy body. Included in the discussion of the causes of disease was a lot of discussion about body chemistry and physiology, which is where we see an overlap with the strictly physiological theories that I talked about last week when I was talking about biology. So let's go into some Hippocratic physiology. I will track this through some later changes in a minute, including talking about Galen's dissections and his vast advances in physiological theory. So many theories of the four elements and theories in terms of primary properties like hot, cold, wet, dry appeared in the Hippocratic corpus. And I talked a bit last week about Empedocles and how he applied this to animal bodies, and then later on Aristotle. But in the Hippocratic corpus we also find other categories like sweet and bitter, acidic, astringent, and so on. And so many of the theories in the Hippocratic corpus don't have this kind of strict four elemental structure that we later see in Aristotle. And if you think about it, that kind of makes sense. A lot of the Hippocratic stuff is contemporaneous with Plato and only really about 20 years after Empedocles. So I think the four element theorem had not kind of completely become dominant in the way it did after Aristotle. And indeed, that strict way four-way relation only kind of becomes settled by Aristotle and then in the period after him. There is some humour theory in the Hippocratic corpus, but it's pretty variable. So you may know the humour theory from medieval texts mainly. They talk about the four humours: phlegm, bile, black bile, blood, and imbalances of those. So phlegm and bile do seem fairly fixed in the Hippocratic corpus, and there's a lot of references to both of them. But there's not the later theory of the four humours that Galen will later on claim is a Hippocratic belief. I'll come back to Galen's views. So the first text we know of that does have humour theory that later becomes pervasive, we get this in The Nature of Man, which is a physiological text. And I'll put a diagram of humour theory as appears there on the screen. There's also, among the Hippocratic's critics of humour theory, for example, the author of the treatise Tradition in Medicine, who says that having abstract postulates is unhelpful, and he refuses to countenance any system that works on strict oppositional principles. So that's a kind of precursor of empiricist thought, I guess you could say. I'm going to talk now about Galen, who was the most prolific medical writer in antiquity. Indeed, actually one of the most prolific writers in antiquity, full stop. We have an enormous amount of Galen. Galen wrote on a huge variety of things. One thing I'm going to talk about now is about some experiments he carried out, which included dissections. Now, I mentioned dissection in the last lecture, talking about Aristotle's dissections of particularly marine creatures. One question that's sometimes asked is whether dissection of human beings, or perhaps even vivisection, ever happened in antiquity. And in general, the answer's no. Usually, human anatomy and physiology was studied in antiquity kind of by reference to similar mammals rather than by direct dissection. But it does seem to have happened very briefly in Alexandria sometime in the 3rd century BC. The reasons are unclear. And it's also possible that Galen might have done some of his own dissections on the corpses of those killed in gladiatorial fights. So I'd like to talk a bit about some of the procedures around dissection in Galen's text on the natural faculties, because it provides a really interesting case study both for the kinds of anatomy and physiology being done in antiquity, but also it is very important for looking at the methodology in some of these ancient medical texts. So I'm going to describe to you a series of experiments, and then I'm going to comment a bit on what's going on here. So Galen does a series of experiments that are vivisections on a pig. So in the first experiment, and the experiments are designed to look at urine production in pigs. So I'll put some diagrams up as I explain the vivisection. So in the first one, Galen performed a vivisection on the pig to expose its ureters, and then he ligatured the ureters, so that's the figure up now. So he then bandaged the pig up and waited and let the pig produce urine. When Galen unbandaged the pig, he could see that urine had not been able to pass through the ligatured ureters, but instead collected there, and the ureters were distended, so that's figure 3 there. So he then took the ligature off the ureters and instead ligatured the pig's urethra. That's this next figure here. So then again he comes back later and he observes that while the pig's bladder's full of urine, the ureters weren't, meaning that the urine could not travel from the bladder back up into the ureters. So this was what Galen was trying to find out, and his hypothesis when he was doing these experiments was that there was a valve between the ureters and the bladder that meant that urine couldn't travel back up the wrong way, and so he considered this to be a demonstration of that. So then he removed the ligature from the pig's urethra, and this time he ligatured only one of the ureters in order to check the test. And when he returned, as predicted, one of the ureters had become distended, but the other was fine, and the urine was flowing as normal into the bladder. So that's that next figure there. Then his final experiment, which is the most unpleasant one, was to make a cut in both of the ureters so that the urine spurted out of them, and that's this figure here. When he went back to check, no urine had got from the ureters into the bladder. It had instead escaped into the pig's body. So this is a rather unpleasant set of experiments, as you can tell, but the methodology here is very interesting. Okay, so we might want to say this is quite similar to a modern experiment. Galen has a hypothesis. His hypothesis is that there's a valve between the ureters and the bladder. He has a control test, so he does it with both ureters and he does it just with one ureter to check. And he has proof that his experiment is repeatable. And we may want to say, well, this really does sound like a modern experiment that follows the scientific method. However, as Julien Devenant has argued, Galen doesn't, interestingly, when he's explaining this experiment he's done, he doesn't seem to accord this method any special epistemic status in his overall approach to physiology. It's not like he says, well, I did this experiment and this is clearly, incontrovertible proof, and this is what you need to do to prove something every time. So while he does perform a number of other experiments of this kind on animal bodies and a number of dissections both of animal and human bodies, he certainly doesn't consider it necessary in every case, nor does he consider it to be necessarily more reliable than more theoretical or just general empirical approaches where he catalogues symptoms or so on. And in fact, if we understand this experiment in its context, it actually comes as part of a polemic against a particular thread of sophistic medical theory, which claimed that the kidneys were an organ of the body that had no function. So Galen's wider point here, in showing that the kidneys are the organ of urine production and that the bladder isn't the organ that produces the urine, it's the kidneys, is to support the Aristotelian theory of physiological telos, which I mentioned last week. So that is that every part of the body has its proper telos or function, and therefore that both the kidneys and the bladder have their own functions, each have their own proper functions in urine production. So I want to return to the notion that I raised in the first week, which was in discussing the Greek miracle. So you'll remember that I discussed an example from Anaximander of the water sphere at the centre of the earth, and the categorisation of this and other such explanations given by the Milesians as natural rather than supernatural explanations. In both the first week and in other lectures, I've talked a little bit about whether the notion of supernatural versus natural is a distinction that's very meaningful to the Greeks. In the case of medicine, I think this is also interesting. So we see here in Galen a very kind of rationalist, empirical approach. We see experiments that we'd say fit, fairly neatly with what we think of as the scientific method, even if, as an important caveat, Galen doesn't take them to be of a special epistemic status. And sometimes people contrast these approaches with what are taken to be more superstitious approaches in Greek medicine. But as I'm going to go on to talk a little bit about the boundaries of kind of religious practice in Greek medicine, I think we'll see that actually the picture is a bit more complicated. One of the Hippocratic texts, often used as an example of a turn towards naturalistic explanations from more supernatural explanations, is the text On the Sacred Disease, which is a short treatise on epilepsy. What's often taken as a clarion call of rationalism is the following right at the opening, and I quote, "I do not believe that the sacred disease is any more divine or sacred than any other disease, but on the contrary has specific characteristics and a definite cause," end quote. And then later on, another passage, I quote, "Men regard its nature and cause as divine from ignorance and wonder, because it's not at all like other diseases. Men in want of the means of life invent many and various things and devise many contrivances for all other things and for this disease, in every phase of the disease, assigning the cause to a god. Neither truly do I count it a worthy opinion to hold that the body of man is polluted by God, the most impure by the most holy," end quote. So these are taken as passages that totally reject supernatural explanations. And the alternative explanation given in the text for epilepsy is that it's due to the build-up of phlegm. And I talked earlier about the four humours, and so this is a text that goes for a four humour theory, and it says epilepsy is due to the build-up of phlegm in the brain. As a side note, this treatise is usually attributed to Hippocrates, or at least it used to be, and part of the reason for that was exactly that it took this apparently very rational and very anti-supernatural approach, and people like to think that that was Hippocrates himself, but actually it's quite unlikely to be by Hippocrates, and various people have shown this because it has this explicit reference to humour theory, which Hippocrates, the other texts that we think maybe are by Hippocrates himself, don't talk about humour theory at all. Anyway, that's a side note, but I don't mean here to say that the text doesn't make a distinction between natural and supernatural causes, or that it doesn't reject the idea that the sacred disease is somehow this kind of specially God-caused thing. And obviously it is a big deal that the text posits the brain as the most important organ for human behaviour, and that will go on to be influential. And I suppose it's important also to note that it's not the only treatise in the Hippocratic corpus with an explanation for the sacred disease or epilepsy. There are other texts that assign the cause of the sacred disease to air and breath. So, for example, in the text Breaths, there's an examination of it, which doesn't go for humour theory, it talks about air and breath. But to contrast a bit with this text, which is sometimes taken as, okay, this is the period in which there was a complete shift, a totally rationalistic explanation, I want to give some slightly contrasting examples. And there's two things I have particularly in mind. One thing is iatromathematics, astrological medicine, which some of the earlier scholars of Greek medicine who would have considered texts like on the sacred disease to be very rational probably would have had a problem with astrological medicine. The other thing I'll talk about in a minute is the Asclepeia or healing sanctuaries. So iatromathematics, astrological medicine, I'm not going to talk about this very much, but it's just a kind of interesting case. So the Hippocratic treatise Dreams includes quite a lot of this, and there are occasional references to the action of the stars in various other treatises across the Hippocratic corpus. So here's a quotation from Dreams, just so you get a picture of what sort of thing they're talking about. So begin quote, "When the heavenly bodies wander in different directions, some mental disturbance as a result of anxiety is indicated," end quote. And this, which is from Airs, Waters, Places, begin quote, "For knowing the changes of the seasons, the risings and settings of the stars, how each of them takes place, he will be able to know beforehand," he is the doctor there, "will be able to know beforehand what sort of a year is going to ensue, and therefore what sort of, in square brackets, therefore what sort of diseases are going to ensue," end quote. So I made an argument in the lecture on astronomy and astrology that astrology has a very good claim to be seen as a rational discipline, as a kind of extension of astronomy. And I'm not trying to argue that we should throw away totally the idea that there's a kind of a rationalist turn in ancient medicine. But I do want to highlight that the things we think of as rational are not the same as the things that ancient people would think of as rational, and iatromathematics could be seen totally as rational. And in fact, the relationship goes both ways. So in Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos, which I talk quite a lot about in lecture 4, quite near the start, there's when Ptolemy is kind of giving a defence of astrology as a practice, there's this extended metaphor about a doctor visiting a patient and the ways in which the doctor makes predictions, and the ways in which those predictions sometimes do happen and sometimes they don't happen because of the interference of other sublunary elements. And so Ptolemy gives this whole defence of astrology as a kind of conjectural, empirical science that is grounded on observation and on making not quite probabilistic, but making predictions that are right given the available information. And he says this is just like medicine. So this relationship between medicine and astrology is a kind of two-way thing. But, we've got to be careful about how far this idea of rationality goes. And the contrasting example, which I want to take, is from not actually from Greek medicine. It comes from Egyptian medicine, and this is also what the Greeks might think of as a quite a rational example, and what we would find a bit strange. So this example comes from a scholar called Sophie Schutt, who works on Egyptian medicine. And it comes from Papyrus Carlsberg 8, which dates to about 1500 BCE. And it's a fragment on ophthalmology. It's talking about a disorder of the eyelid and the eyelash. It's not clear exactly what's intended, but it clearly refers to too much hair growing, or some kind of ingrown hair, or some problem with the hairs of the eyelash. I'm not sure what the current term for that disease would be. But the cure in the papyrus is that the doctor should take the blood of a lizard, the blood of a bat, and some myrrh, and apply it to the eyelid. And then a second cure is given that makes reference to Horus, the god of the eye, and I can't remember whether it's a sort of prayer or incantation, but it's something that we would recognise as a kind of religious option. So this remedy with the blood of the lizard and bat and so on is found again in Dioscorides, who's a 1st century Greco-Roman doctor. And then it crops up again in a 6th century Coptic text, but this time instead of lizard blood and bat blood, it's bat blood and shrimp blood. And then it comes up again in the medieval Islamic doctor Ibn Zur in the 12th century, this time just as bat blood. Then in Petrus Hispanus in the 13th century, again, bat blood. And when you think about why this quite strange collection of animals might be being used here, when you begin to think about it, one thing that they all have in common, lizards, bats and shrimps, all have no hair. They're hairless animals. And the disease is about having too much hair in the eyelid. And the principle of the reasoning seems to be a kind of one of sympathetic medicine. And we know that this is a big feature of Egyptian and indeed Greek medicine, that cures were often devised on a kind of notion of like with like, or of balancing. And we've seen this before. We've seen this in Aristotelian physics or chemistry, depending on what you'd like to call it. And we've seen it in humour theory, we've seen it in Empedocles, the theories of the 4 elements. There's this notion that keeping things in balance requires a sort of analogical principle of reasoning. And here the idea is that if you've got too much hair, you use these parts of these hairless animals, and their hairlessness, some property of their hairlessness will correct what's going wrong with you. Now, we would see this as... We don't see this as rational at all, and we'd see this as kind of weird and superstitious. And how's this come up? Why are you using these bloods of these animals? There's no kind of underlying physical explanation for what's actually happening. It's this kind of weird metaphorical transference. But in Greek and Egyptian religion, this would be seen as, in Greek and Egyptian medicine, this would be seen as a totally legitimate form of reasoning. What's interesting as well about this is that the remedy that mentions Horus, the god who's associated with the eye, doesn't make it into the Greek stuff. So there's clearly a sort of selection process of what's appropriate for that religious or cultural context. But in case we start to think that Greek medical texts never make reference to the gods, there's this very important contrasting example, which is that of the Asclepiae. And the Asclepiae are a set of temple sites. So the cult of the healing god Asclepius really took off in the 5th century BC. The doctors Machaon and Podalirius, who appear in the Iliad, are said to be sons of Asclepius, and this is their kind of, mythological heritage. But Asclepius later becomes a kind of deified figure, and these temples start to spring up, first in Tricca and then in Epidaurus in the Peloponnese. And that's the site, Epidaurus, that became most associated with Asclepius in later centuries. And the temple there at Epidaurus is absolutely huge. We think it's probably where Hippocrates trained. We think that Galen probably trained at an Asclepieion in Pergamon. So the Asclepieion at Epidaurus was very wealthy. It was very well maintained. And you may, if you've read Plato's Apology, remember that Socrates' dying words are that he owes a cockerel to Asclepius. They were very places that a lot of people visited. So how did they work? Well, patients would come in, often they would stay overnight for a form of what's called incubation, which is sleeping overnight in the sanctuary, often in the hope of having predictive dreams from the gods or healing through sleep from the gods. Sometimes patients would stay for several days. Sleeping areas were, as far as we know, separated into male and female, and some of the larger Asclepiae were separated by the different diseases that people had. And that's caused some people to get quite excited about whether these are kind of a forerunner of hospitals. I think there's some interest in that line of inquiry, but it's worth remembering that many religious sanctuaries did have a similar arrangement, not just for the sick, but also refugees could stay in temples, and they had a similar overnight sleeping arrangement. So it's not kind of exclusively a thing to do with medicine. We have some documentary evidence. We have quite a lot of case histories from the Asclepiae, many of which are quite similar to the case histories in Epidemics, the Hippocratic text that I quoted from earlier. And the kinds of remedies they talk about, if I just give you a list of some of the things that are mentioned, I hope you'll see the point I'm trying to make. So there were sometimes surgeries performed, possibly using some kind of opiates as painkillers. There was a use of prayer, incantation. There were sacred dogs and sacred snakes who roamed the site, who were sometimes interacted with patients. Sometimes sacred dogs licked people's wounds. There was use of poultices. There was a lot of attention paid to regimen, which I mentioned earlier, so diet and exercise and so on. So there's this whole range of things. And I hope what emerges kind of from that list and the jumbled up way in which I've read them out is that I think for many of the doctors, and particularly for many of the patients, it wouldn't really make sense to separate this stuff into what's rational and what's not, or what's supernatural, or so on. Of course, they have some notion of which things come from the gods and which things don't come from the gods. But the fact that these are all practiced in the same place, doctors are training here, doctors who we think of as ultra-rationalists like Galen, training in an Asclepieion, surgery is being done alongside prayer. I think it's one of those things where it's seen as you take a variety of different approaches, and it's not always worth separating out which ones count as kind of scientific and which don't. So I hope this has given you a brief overview of some of the things included in ancient medical works, in particular the diversity of the type of diseases they treated, the kind of philosophical issues they were interested in, and some of the methods they used, including, in the case of Galen, experimentation, but lots of more theoretical methods as well. Next week I am going to be talking about ancient Greek mathematics, and that will be mostly about geometry, but I will include some stuff on harmonics and optics as well.